Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 64 with Sean McCoy and David Ewalt. Is Wizards of the Coast mucking this up?
Greetings once again, assembled internet hordes, to this, a podcast currently with no name. If you have an idea about what this podcast should be named, please let me know. Email me at admin@readingdndaloud.net. But we don't really read D&D aloud on this anymore, and we've clearly morphed into a conversation podcast, which is delightful. So let me introduce the two people that we are going to have a conversation with today. First up, David M. Ewalt, journalist, editor, and author of the engaging, wonderful, and visible behind me of Dice and Men. He is currently, unless this has changed since I looked on your website, but he is currently the editor-in-chief of Scientific American, which may make him the most prestigious personage I've ever actually had on this podcast. He is also the author of Defying Reality, the inside story of the virtual reality revolution, and has worked at Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here and to have this conversation.
And I contacted David asking if he would come on the podcast, and if he did, who he would want to talk to. And he gave me a list. And whenever that happens, I always start with the person that I think will be the hardest to get. And that person is Sean McCoy, who has agreed to come on and talk to David. Sean is the creative whirlwind behind Mothership, the award-winning sci-fi horror role-playing game that has taken the scene by absolute storm. Mothership is tense, terrifying, totally unforgettable, and yet somehow is rules light. He is, without a doubt, a hotshot of 21st century game design and also a real get for the podcast. So welcome, Sean.
Glad to be here. I was hard to get because I said no to being on the podcast before, but when Ben said, hey, David wants to talk to you, I said, I'm totally in. Sorry. Not because I don't like doing podcasts, but with the young kids, it's really hard to carve out an hour of quiet time where nobody's yelling.
So right before I hit record, we began to venture into the territory of bashing Wizards of the Coast. And I was like, let me hit record. And ordinarily my first question is, David, why did you want to talk to Sean? But maybe we should venture into talking about Wizards of the Coast and where it is, because I've done 24 interviews with former employees at this point. And David, I'd love to hear what you're hearing on your end, and let's go from there. Is that okay, Sean?
Sure, that sounds great.
All right.
Yeah, well, for me, the Wizards of the Coast conversation, especially right now, starts with Hasbro, with the owner, because Hasbro they just came out with their earnings, and it's been a real kind of interesting. They overspent on some acquisitions. There's lots of bigger stuff going on in the company, but one of the things that was interesting is that they've seen big profits in the division where Dungeons and Dragons is. 5 years back, they reorganized the whole company of Hasbro to be around Dungeons and Dragons because it was doing so well. So they have this department, this section of the company that's called Wizards and Digital Gaming. I think that's what they call it. But what I thought was interesting is that Magic the Gathering is making tons of money, but they really haven't had too much to say about the success of D&D, so Wizards of the Coast seems to be, I don't know. Because the new edition of D&D came out, right? And on one hand, they said, oh, this is the fastest selling player's handbook we've ever had. Sold more than any player's handbook. But I wonder, I still don't know. Is that because the audience for D&D has gotten so big over the last 10 years that even if 1 out of 20 players bought it, that automatically makes it the biggest seller? Or is it genuinely that everybody bought it? I don't know. But what is very curious to me, on top of not knowing how successful the new edition is a lot of good people jumping ship. What I hear from inside is that, it's a real moment where people are like, you know what, I'm kind of done here. I want to do more interesting things. And Wizards of the Coast is not the place for interesting things right now. The thing, though, is there's still some really cool designers there, some really smart people.
Reverend Jim Wyatt.
Up on them. Yeah, exactly. Jim Wyatt, first and foremost, one of the great geniuses of D&D and who's been involved for a long time, but a lot of young designers too who are really promising. And so I haven't given up on them, but it's disheartening seeing such talented people leave. I mean, especially people who were so core to the success of fifth edition.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from the inside is that Hasbro and WotC is like any big corporation where there's tons of factionalism, the numbers are hinky, and ultimately, not to go on like a giant rant against like capitalism and boards and all this sort of stuff, but like D&D is this huge IP that they don't seem to know what to do with. And I think part of that is because they don't really see themselves as like, I'm sure some people they do, but like they're stewards of this thing that like we love, right? But for Hasbro, if it's not like year over year insanely profitable, it's not valuable. That's not like a moral judgment. That's like the way like a publicly traded company works, right? So that can put them in these odd situations where they have to do things that are bad for the brand in order to hit an earnings report or to make a report to shareholders like, well, why isn't D&D doing what Magic the Gathering's doing,
Exactly.
It seems like they're making decent moves of like bringing all the licensing back in house, getting D&D under one umbrella. But I think purely from like an anecdotal vibes perspective, D&D 1, 6th edition, D&D Beyond was a huge swing and a miss.
Yeah.
Not only did they alienate this giant base they had built up over the years, but it seems clear that they have no real idea of where they're going. It gives a lot of credence to like every other edition of D&D is good, like fan theory. But the numbers they have to hit to be considered a success are so phenomenally huge. I backed HeroScape when it was at like Hasbro Labs, and it did huge numbers, and they canceled it because huge numbers to me, life-changing numbers to me, are nothing to Hasbro. And so you have these massive brands that if they were sort of spun off, if D&D was just its own company, would be, bigger than Chaosium, just a huge giant, but they wouldn't have to be compared to Magic the Gathering or some completely other different product line. And on top of that, from what I've heard, it's not like there's a cohesive, univocal sort of vision for what D&D is from the inside. There's tons of competing factions, and with people leaving, maybe that power will consolidate under a single vision. But it's just really, really going to be hard to steer that ship.
So the rumor I keep hearing that doesn't happen, and I'll keep repeating the rumor because I keep hearing it is they're going to spin D&D off or something like that. But Hasbro has
License
no
it.
yeah, Hasbro has no history of doing something like that, so it'd be weird. Again, maybe it's just wishful thinking on the part of people. Um, I suppose it's worth mentioning when you talk about one umbrella and how I forget who said they're bringing everything D&D back under one person. I mean, that was the D&D studio model that Nathan Stewart had, and I think he started in 2015 or 2016. And what you probably think of as the golden age of 5e was run by this D&D studio at Wizards, where everybody who touches D&D does nothing but touch D&D, and they're all reporting directly to Nathan Stewart, who was, as I recall, his title was something like the VP of D&D. Um, and then that was really, really successful. So of course they were like, okay, we're going to change everything now. Since you've been a success, we're going to change everything. So now that you can be a real mega success, and for a lot of reasons, they've had trouble uh, bringing that back. I would point out I'm listening to this book called Slugfest, which is about the rivalry between Marvel and DC. And the author keeps coming back to Marvel started getting hot in the 60s because they started selling comic books to people that weren't buying comic books before. And in my experience, when I look at D&D sales numbers, they go up when they are bringing new people into the hobby, and they go down when they're not doing that. And during 5e, new people were absolutely pouring into the hobby. The question is, has that stopped? I don't know. Again, I teach seventh and eighth grade, which is a great barometer because,
Mhm.
like, to me, D&D has become ubiquitous. The teachers play it, the kids play it. If you don't play it, you kind of want to be playing it and you're interested in it. So you would think Hasbro could make something out of that. But I don't know. Again, that verbiage of the fastest selling in D&D history is
Mhm.
so suspicious.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you're reading the thing about Marvel and DC because I think that's the thing to really pay attention to. You got to remember we're not just talking about Wizards of the Coast, we're talking about Hasbro. And the problem is that the executives at Hasbro who are really in charge, the vast majority of them are not D&D people, maybe have never even played D&D. So when they look at the brand and the value of the game, they're not even thinking like, "Oh, can we get more people playing tabletop role playing?" In their mind, that will never be big enough for Hasbro to justify it. What they really want is a Marvel situation. They want it to be, okay, we've got the tabletop game. We've got the D&D movies. There is a D&D TV show. There's the D&D video games. We're selling D&D merch. You've got your D&D licensing. You've got Funko Pops and a million other things. I guarantee you they're all talking about like, yeah, why is this not the Marvel universe? And they're trying and some of it works. Like the D&D movie ended up being really good. I was
Really good.
shocked. Yeah, but like it had box office issues. Now they're not sure if there's gonna be a second. It's like it's hard. Only one franchise has ever been able to pull off the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But that's what Hasbro's really wants. They don't
It's
particularly care about role playing.
it's tough because I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible for D&D to be this hydra of IP and licensing, but it takes some like grit and determination to decide you're going to do it over a long period of time. You can't be shook quarter to quarter. I don't think D&D movies failings had as much to do with the quality of the movie itself as it did just outside market forces that were way, way, way beyond its control. But it's a great, if they
They
came out with
opened
another
it a
one,
week before the Mario movie. Of course it was going to get
right.
killed, you know?
And the theaters are getting hammered. So I just think you need to have a longer term vision and say, like, this brand has survived 50 years. It will survive 50 years more with the right stewardship. And we can do all these things that we want to do. We just have to decide we're going to follow it through and not just like chase after everything we see. Though notably, I think like, isn't chasing Hollywood sort of what brought a little bit of the end of TSR to begin with? So um, maybe the writing's on the wall there.
The to I'm going to avoid the hookers and blow in the Hollywood Hills
Sure.
unless David wants to say something about it. But
Have you had Luke on yet, or any of the Gygaxes? They
uh,
could tell some stories about what happened out in Hollywood that I'm not going to tell.
I mean, he hasn't really talked to me in a couple years. I don't know that that's a statement of policy or coincidence. Um, but like when I see him, I am sometimes afraid he's going to punch me. He's a big dude. He seems
He's a
really
big
nice
dude,
though.
but he's too nice to punch anybody, unless like he's fighting because he is a soldier. But no, Luke's not going to punch you. He's a nice guy.
Okay, good to know. But if you look at the examples of short-term thinking and Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards Hasbro in the past 25 years, it's stunning. Uh, Peter Adkison was working on a D&D MMO in 2001, and they sold the digital rights out from underneath him. It would have come out before World of Warcraft. Who knows what that means for life, the universe, and everything? But getting a D&D MMO out before World of Warcraft would have been amazing. 4 years later, Hasbro was like, we need something like World of Warcraft.
Sure.
What are we gonna do? And they invest tens of millions of dollars in a project that's supposed to go along with fourth edition, and it's largely wasted. The only thing that ever sees the light of day is kind of a rules compendium and a character generator. And some of the fourth edition guys are like, that killed sales for fourth edition. It was $7.95 a month, and you could download it. You don't need to buy the rules for if you can do that for $7.95 a month. Um, and they didn't get the video game rights back until 2011, I think. They hire. I'm doing a lot of work on Nathan Stewart lately, in case you can't tell, but they hire Nathan Stewart because he's a Madden guy to try and digitize D&D. He basically proposes making something like D&D Beyond to go with fifth edition. He says it's going to cost $5 million. They tell him no. Time passes and they spend $144 million buying D&D Beyond instead. And again, just this total unwillingness on their part to spend some money, take a chance on D&D, and be in the forefront, results in them constantly playing catch up and maybe spending more money in the long run. I don't know if I can say that for sure, but it's not a good look. So
more broadly, there's a reluctance along the like financial manager class to like build infrastructure across like every sector. In my library today, there at both the branches that are close to me, there's a weekly D&D group, which is the kind of marketing you cannot buy, right? But yeah, I would be building that out in schools and libraries and churches and all these places, right? Magic is doing this thing that I thought was totally stupid, where they've brought in all these other IPs like Final Fantasy or Junji Ito or whatever, but they are focusing on the fact that they want to bring in new players, right? And if they can do that by putting out some limited edition weird IP, they don't really care, you know? And it seems to be working. So I don't know if that means like more Rick and Morty D&D. I wouldn't love that, but there is a case to be made that like just keep uh like the Coke Pepsi wars had a similar thing where like it didn't matter so much like the Coke branding or the Coke taste or whatever. It mattered that like Coke could put a Coke can in like every continent. You know what I mean? Like their distribution network was so powerful. Um, we were talking to Alliance, not to like badmouth the distributor, but I was saying, hey, we'd love you to buy some Mothership. We're working with these distributors, blah, blah. Here's our brag sheet. And the sales rep was like, I'll be honest, I got to pitch this to my guy, and my guy doesn't know games. He hasn't heard of any games. And so if he wants to go for it, he'll go for it. If he doesn't, he doesn't, you know? And then they got back to me in a couple weeks and they're like, it's going to be a pass. And I was like, okay, that's fine. Like, not everybody has to buy Mothership. But that's the
no,
kind of
Sean,
people you're
everybody
dealing
has
with.
to buy Mothership. It's really good.
Everybody should. Yeah.
But that's the kind of thinking that goes on in some of these rooms, is like completely divorced from the product.
Yeah.
Well, should I pivot us? Does anyone else want to kick the straw man that is Wizards anymore?
Well, the only thing I'll say that I think Shawnee made a good point about, like, is there going to be another Rick and Morty supplement? I mean, we saw just this week they announced the brand new Stranger Things box set, and that's
Yeah.
the sort of brand tie-in which makes some sense. I mean, it's literally they play D&D in the game, but like I'm willing to bet yes, there will be another Rick and Morty. There might be a Transformers Dungeons and Dragons and My Little Pony Dungeons and Dragons. Like they, you know, the guys at Hasbro have seen the success of Magic with those things, and they're like, I don't care, just do it at D&D, figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll throw one other thing out there. So in interviewing the guys that were fired when Project Sigil went down, I don't even know if they called it Project Sigil when Sigils, their supposedly amazing virtual tabletop went down. Um, a question I asked them was like, what was this product going to be? Who was it for? And a lot of the time they'd be like, we're not entirely sure. I want to say Andy Collins, who was one of the fourth edition designers who was fired from Wizards of the Coast after fourth edition and then rehired to work on Sigil for 2 years. He asked that question and the answer was essentially, "I will get back to you." But there was apparently a vision of a sort of digital toy box where the technology they were developing in Sigil would allow you to like buy digital transformers and play with them in this space and digital GI Joes. And when they were selling it to Hasbro, apparently that was the thing that they used to justify the expense of Sigil. So yeah, that's the last thing I'll say because it just was triggered by what you guys were both saying. But let me ask this question: anybody have an opinion what Gary Gygax would say if he could sit down and play Mothership?
Oh, I think he'd dig it. I think he'd be really into it. Right? Like the
I'll take
core
it.
of Gary's being was liking to sit down at a table with a bunch of people and have a really good story and just game. And especially he liked challenging games, right? Like he liked killing people. So like I think he'd be all in on Mothership. He'd be like, yeah, this game's cool.
Um, a question for you guys who know so much more sort of about his MO than I do. The more I learn, everything else I read makes me go like he was obsessed with writing rules that he had no intention of using at the table. That it was more like this is the product, this is the way it needs to be. I'm writing this for somebody, but it seemed like at home he was just gonna do whatever. Um, I don't mean that in a GM fiat kind of way, but in what we would maybe say is more improvisational or story gamey. And maybe there's some tables there in the background, but it didn't over time. You see this with, like Mark Miller too, with Traveler, where like people have talked like, "What do you do?" And he's like, "I just roll 2d6, and if it's high, it happens. If it's low, it doesn't happen." And this is a thing I wonder about a lot of designers, which is that you write these rules because you want to be a serious designer. But when you're at the table, you kind of default back to like, I'm just playing games with my friends. It really doesn't matter. Did you get that impression from Gygax with your research and that kind of stuff?
I'd be curious to hear what Ben thinks, but yeah, my sense is sort of that like, well, part of the thing about Gary was he was you have to think of him both as a businessman and as a game person. And
Right.
I think, when you talk about his interest in rules and things like that, I think it was because he was very single-mindedly focused on making this product successful and on selling as much of it as possible, coming up with like, oh, there's a new rule set. Like he knew you had to come up with new rules to get people to buy new books. You couldn't just leave them with the old book. So I think that's what a lot of the rules extensions were, was like, yeah, it's a product. And also it was ownership stuff, right? The whole reason for AD&D was to push
Yeah.
other people out of the picture. This is my edition. That said, I think, Gary came out of wargaming, which is very rules centric. But yeah, I don't think, having never played with him, my sense is that he would certainly be less rules centric at his table than he was in his products, because I think he put him in different places in his brain almost,
It's so funny how far the OSRs come in that like there is no canonical D&D. There's, folk D&D or like the D&D at my table or the playground D&D or whatever you want to call it. Which is sort of everything he fought against with like codifying AD&D is like there's all these offshoots. We've clearly created something amazing, but this is the official one that you have to buy. And this has always been, I think, the trouble with D&D as like a cultural force versus an institution, like we've been talking about, is like you've kind of got a tiger by the tail, and you have to be really, I'm using too many metaphors here. You have to kind of ride that cultural wave and just go like it belongs to the people, and there are ways to support them and still sell a lot of books. But the tighter you know, make your grip or whatever, the more star systems are going to slip through your fingers. And you see that with like Gary and really trying to codify and hold something that like is very, very resistant to being held, as we've seen.
I would briefly uh, posit the difference in Gary is not like 1974 Gary versus like 1979 Gary. Like Sean, I think it was at Gen Con a few years ago that I bought the Mothership, you know, player's guide. It's this thin. I forget how much I paid for it, but I bet it was less than $15. Um, and I don't think this is actually the right copy, but you said this is our OD&D when you were
Yeah.
selling it to me. And our first edition will be a box set that comes later, and now here comes along the box set. And I thought that was in some ways perfect, and in some ways is also a perfect answer to this. I think 1974 Gary would attack Mothership and be like, oh great, perfect, here we go. In 1979 Gary would have this urge to flesh it out in some way. But I don't you're people who have played with him, uh said he usually didn't have any rules at the table with him. He just ran with it. um I'm pretty sure that's the way Arneson played too, because there were no books for Arneson.
Right.
So I would answer this by saying the rules light attitude of Mothership captures the instincts of the founders at their best.
That's
I
really
like that.
kind. Um, I'm running into that problem as well. We spent so long on 1E, and we did have to flesh out and codify things. We got our first like haters. They were, I mean, they were very sweet, but they're like, oh, I don't like the new character sheet. It's too clean. I don't like the new this. It's too whatever, which was really interesting to see happen sort of live. Um, and then your desire to like teach people or to sand off the rough edges is very much there because you've got bills to pay. Um, and then you're sitting down at the table and you're like, I don't remember. Did we decide on one warp core? Was it two? You know how I know we wrote this down and we argued about it for weeks, and it's like it's not important at all, but it feels very important because you've worked on it, you know. Um, and so there's sort of is that hard thing to like the business you versus the gamer you, where the gamer you is like, it doesn't matter, like move it along. And the business you is like, okay, we're gonna do another round of development on, you know, mining and credits and how many hexes you can move in a day. We really have to get this right, you know.
Dave, you want to say anything, or should I ask another question?
Oh yeah, no, I thought you were jumping in with a question, but that's
No,
a good,
I was
you know,
scribbling one down, but sorry, go ahead.
this is a good opportunity to just talk about Mothership, which is why, like, yeah, we didn't get to the question yet. Why did I want to talk to Sean? But it's because Mothership is so damn good. Um, like you, Ben, I have my original one, but I was also a backer of the box set, which came out this year. I swear I did not plant this, but if you look behind me over, like, when I'm sitting at my desk typing, I have a handful of like gaming stuff within reach. I've got like the three new core source books for D&D. I have an excellent indie RPG called Between the Skies that I helped playtest, and I've got my Mothership box set there. And I've got that there, one, because I think it's such a good product, but two, because one of the things I've always loved most about role-playing games, and that really helped get me into D&D, is I used to love just like pulling down the deities and demigods book and just like reading like it was a book, like, oh yeah, I'm going to read about Thor now, or oh, this is some of the Cthulhu mythos and stuff like this. And that's one of the things I love about Mothership, is just like, yeah, I'm going to pull this down and I'm going to flip through the I forget what you call it, the one that's essentially the monster manual, the
Oh yeah, yeah.
unconfirmed contacts, and just
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
different monsters, and be like, oh yeah, this monster's so good. Like, I love this. I love the engineer. I want to get this into one of the games or something. It's good to read, which is always, I think, a really hard thing to do with a role-playing game, but it's always a mark of like, oh yeah, this is going to be fun to play, just because it's fun to immerse myself in the world and read about it.
We talk a lot about like role-playing games, and we think about this, we started in board games too. They're promises, which is why it's so easy to collect them, right? Because they all promise some future good time, right? Whether the game like lives up to that promise that it makes to the player is like whether or not it's a good game, right? And so we think about like what promises are we making to our audience. I remember that was a really interesting. Adam Coble did like a read along of the player's guide, and it was like the first sentence was like, okay, we're gonna, you know, excavate dangerous ruins, exterminate aliens, and blah 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 blah. And he was like, okay, those are the three things we're gonna learn how to do this game. And if it does, we don't learn how to do them. And I was like, oh, I never. We said that as like introductory text, but we didn't frame it as like these are the three, you know, core pillars, as you say in D&D, of like Mothership. Um, but we think about that a lot, is like with unconfirmed contact reports, which has been a hit in some ways and a miss in others, is like we wanted very much to say like this is making a promise to like what it's going to be like when it hits your table. Deities and demigods is a great example too of like you know, I'm in all these OSR arguments too about like lore and, you know, how big should books be and what kind of text should you have. But deities and demigods strikes that balance of like you read something and go like, I really want to build this out.
Mhm.
Not like this isn't built out enough, I don't know what to do with this, and not like, well, there's so much lore here, I really can't tinker. There's like a really sweet spot where it like kind of lights a spark under you to want to create. Um, versus like I love the West End Games version of Star Wars, but Star Wars is a really hard game for me to get to the table because I'm always going, well, I'd like there to be Jedi and I'd like there to be the Empire and I'd like there to be the Rebels, but like none of these things exist at the same time, and it feels weird if I do it here and it feels weird if I do it here. There's so much lore. I found myself researching like, okay, where's Hut space? Okay, and what are the factions? Because that information's out there for me to find. And if I tinker with any of it, If I go like, okay, here's another Jedi who survived Order 66, the whole thing starts to fall apart for me, not for everybody. Um, but that's that line that's really hard to walk, and deities and demigods walks it incredibly well.
Yeah, and I think if that's what you're aiming for, like you did it very successfully with the game as a whole, but particularly like that the unconfirmed contacts. Like I like that it puts you in, it gives you the feeling of the game. Like, okay, this is the sort of mysterious, spooky, it's not just straight up, this is not a horror game in the vein of serial killers and Jason and Freddy. It's more of like the mysterious, weird Cthulhu mythos kind of stuff. But I love those descriptions because it gets me in the lore, but you're also not telling me everything about those creatures. It's just enough that I'm going to have a ton of questions. And as a GM, as a warden, like that's for me is like, oh, this is an interesting start. Now I can fill in the blanks. Oh, that's a cool idea. There's this weird meme film that is filled with horrific stuff and appears on different places, but that's all you've told me. So now I get to fill in like what is that? Where does it come from? What does it do? And so I love that it's like you did a very good job with the game in that, but also just in like the Warden's Manual. I think you did a very good job giving a starting place for GMs, for game designers, and for people to know like, okay, now I understand what I'm getting into, and I've gotten a good leaping off place into I'm going to make my own game from this.
That's really kind of you to say. Like I'm not a very good GM. I'm a forever GM because I'm a friend organizer. Um, and so all of these are like hard won lessons from just like scouring blogs and being like, okay, that works. Okay, that works. I started with a lot of the questions I had. It really bummed me out that like there's no edition of D&D that starts with like get out a notebook.
Mhm.
Okay, and there's mapping and there's hex crawling and sort of this sort of stuff, but like the term we use internally is like literacy, is like referee GM literacy. Um, we want to build that infrastructure. That's a long-term project with like that's why our rules are free. We have an online like class that you can take that we're going to invest more into. We've got this free app. The Warden's Guide is such a big part of our strategy. Um, and it's because one, right now we're very reliant, and I think the entire industry is very reliant on the kind of DMs you get from Hasbro, or you're reliant on somebody's older brother or cousin, right? And there's a real power there to like the oral tradition and how D&D has survived so long. But we had to say like, well, we've got to find a way to teach people how to do this from zero. And we have to bring in new customers, right? So if we can be the place where they go like, well, if you want to learn how to run games, you should go read the Warden's Guide. That's where we want to be if we want to be a game in 50 years. Um, and it starts very, very basically with like call some people, schedule a time, get out a notebook. Here's what prep looks like. Because I have so many of these questions of like, you read these blogs and these guys are running games for 20 or 30 years. And I'm always going like, what do your notes look like? What's
Yeah.
it like when you sit down to go like, what's this NPC doing? Because people talk a lot about, one-to-one time or, West marches or all these campaign styles. But I'm very interested in the like brass tacks sort of stuff where you're going, okay, so what I do is I get home and I write down, 10 bullet points of everything that happened, and then I go through an index card box and I pull out NPCs. Or if a lot of people are just like, I just kind of think about it and I write down a few notes and then we run with it. James Malashevsky runs campaigns from Gargnardi for 10 years, and a lot of it's not super heavy on the world building and the note taking, right? Which is a skill, but how do we like teach people to acquire that skill? Is a big question we're constantly asking ourselves.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important question right now because, like, so I think of two things. One is I look at the history of role-playing games and my part in it, too, is so when I was a kid, I was super into D&D, read the books, like that was part of it was what I did with my friends. But when I hit, and this was also in the 80s, so it was when D&D was really popular. It was, oh, it's in the opening scene of ET, they're playing, I was that age. They're playing D&D, so like it was big. And I want, but then it sort of faded a little bit. And at that same time as it started fading, I didn't stop playing role-playing games, but my friends and I moved on to other games. We played Cyberpunk, and then we got super into Shadowrun, and but we got into the White Wolf games. We had a long-running campaign of Vampire the Masquerade.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
so when I look at the market right now, I see all these kids who started playing D&D during the pandemic. And now that there's a new edition that is not their edition exactly the same way as it was, I think maybe this is an inflection moment. We're like, is this the moment when all those kids who started with fifth edition are now like, you know what, I'm going to look at all these indie RPGs and try something else. But one of the issues I think the indie RPG world has as a whole is that a lot of the games are made for like hardcore gamers and can be really hard to get into and GM because like some of them are so brilliant, they're conceptual and it's like, oh, this is a really interesting world, but they're also very rules light, and often that means not just easier for the players for the rules, but harder for a inexperienced game master because like they need more guidance to get into
Yeah.
these weird new worlds. And so I like that that was your approach to it, and it's one that I think has been super you succeeded with. Like it works, and I was so glad to see that in the game of like, oh great, this is the kind of game where I could take it to my 15-year-old nephew. Aside from the fact that maybe it's a little bit too mature for him, but he's mature. But like that's the kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Like he could read that and instantly sort of figure out, okay, I get what this game is, and I have an idea how I could run it. Where if, other games, might be brilliant, but yeah, he's gonna be intimidated in a way that I don't think he would be with your game.
With I think some of this comes from our background in board games and party games, which is that like we're very aware of the cost of teaching somebody how to play a game. Somebody's got to
Two
buy
rooms
it,
and a boom.
terms and a boom.
Mhm.
Yeah. Uh, they have to learn it. They have to teach their friends. Then you have to like play poorly a couple times. There's like no skipping, like this is going to be a bad version of the game before we're even like really playing the game. And so with our party games, Terms of the Boom, Russian Roulette, that's eliminated. We really go from like we call it time to table. But we also try to have like the game teach you the game by the end of the first turn, all that sort of stuff. And that really impacts how we design RPGs because a lot of people who design RPGs just go like, you know what an RPG is, right? Okay, so it's like that, except it's in space, right? And that whole first part, it'd be insane for me to be like, chess, right? It's like chess, but these things are called checkers. There's so much more, and then you could do that to a certain extent in board games, right? Like you've played deck building, you've played a Euro game, but like to write that rule book, it would be insane. But like it's a common meme in RPGs to be like, oh, another what is a role-playing game section. Everybody knows what a role-playing game is. And I'm saying like you're missing a key opportunity here to like use that space really, really effectively to somebody who doesn't know what a role-playing game is and to tackle that question differently in a way that will get them up to speed very, very quickly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think
Yeah,
like investing in that kind of infrastructure is just always going to pay off.
on a similar note, something else I think you did really effectively that I'm interested in how you approached it this way is I think people can often find the genre of horror intimidating, like to run a game.
Yeah,
Because if I'm a new GM and I'm going to be running a D&D or fantasy RPG of any kind, all right, maybe I don't have an idea this week. I know how I can just have a cave full of kobolds and you're going to have to fight some stuff and kill it. Or I can come up with a real simple plot line. The dragon
hmm,
stole this thing, go get it. But with horror, you're now asking the GM to not only come up with a plot line, but oh, by the way, what you're really trying to do is be scary. Like that's a
yeah,
whole nother element. You're trying to create an atmosphere, which is not usually a problem or something you're dealing with a fantasy RPG. You have different challenges. And so it can be real intimidating for GMs to be like, okay, I really am excited about this game, but I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can do horror. And one of the things I loved about Mothership was that, so I'm also just a big horror movie fan. I see a ton of movies, of horror movies. I love horror movies. And I thought the tomb system, just the way that you broke down how horror happens, not only made the game work a lot better because it helps people figure out, oh, this is how I'm going to be scary and tell a scary story. I also thought it was just a really good breakdown of like, this is what horror is as a genre, and it works. I think there are like horror movie people who might have made better movies if they'd like, okay, read this Tombs thing and it'll help you understand. It's not just about cutting people's heads off. There's more to this.
Sean, could you summarize that for the audience?
Tomb stands for transgression, omens, manifestation, banishment, and slumber. And it's basically a 5 act structure that you could analyze or break down a horror plot into. My background is in screenwriting and film. That's what I wanted to get into as a kid. And so when I started working on the Warden's Guide, I was tooling around with this idea of like, okay, how could we break this down into a structure? Three's probably too small because it's just like beginning, middle, and end. Let's do five. Let's start coming up. I did some research and looking around. How can we come up with some terms? I started writing down terms. I thought about making it more like a ritual, you know, and then I started thinking about it like a ritual, and then I started codifying the names, and then I was like, I really want this to say something. We were very close to like doom to, and and then when Tombs clicked for me was like a couple weeks later. I'd worked on other things, and I was like, it was called Tombs, Transgression, Omens, Manifestation, Banishment, Slumber, and I remembered it, and I was like, okay, well, if I can remember it without like thinking about it too much, like I think there's something sticky there. There's somebody on our Discord who they run a film podcast or screenwriting podcast, and they were like, we're breaking down a couple films with Tombs now for new episodes, because we like the structure so much. So yeah, I think two things. One is, and we say this, and I believe it because I'm a big scaredy cat. I love horror movies, but I'm terrified of them. We've turned off movies at my house and been like, okay, that's enough for tonight. Um, but we're like always like drawn in and fascinated by them. One is that like the game doesn't have to be scary, and this has been a long-term conversation with me and my partner Alan. Um, is like games, particularly like tabletop games, have it incredibly hard to do horror because any element can break it, right? We've even asked like, can there be a game that you would be scared to play, right? Like I'm not scared to play Mansions of Madness, right? I'm maybe a little scared to play like a Ouija board, right? Because of like, is it a real thing? So it's a question we come back to a lot. So our advice to wardens is like, don't worry about that. That's really on like whether the players are going to be open to that experience, whether they want that experience. I've had a totally casual Mothership game like over Zoom where I said like, okay, and then you hear something scratching in the fence and you look down and you see a little girl. And one of my players was like, I'm fucking out. But that's just like that was where he was at. It had nothing to do with the environment or me or whatever. He was just ready and willing to let himself be scared by that image, right? So we just tell people it's just a game. It's just a game like any game. We would rather you walk away and have had fun, than walk away and be like they weren't really scared, right? That's something you could develop over a longer time, whether your players are into it, whether they're not, whether you find something horrific that they're into, and then there's all these like safety tools and all these sort of things that go into horror. So we're gonna aim at fun in the wrapping of horror, right? And that's why we have things like fear saves. Like the characters are going to be scared. You're ordering pizza, realistically. Like that's what's happening at a role playing table. Um, and so like to go along with like tombs, it's very helpful for us to be like, but this is like the structure of how the stuff sort of works, so that you know that you're hitting the like the beats that make sense, not in terms of like this is the narrative, but I tried really hard to be like, okay, transgression is just like the players do something, or something had happened in the past that was like a mistake, right? Omens, this is very easy for the warden. It's like, what are the signs that something's going to happen, right? Which is a great part of horror. And it's a really good invitation to the players to be like, okay, something's coming. This is great for even like D&D monster battles or traps, right? What are the signs that something's going to happen? Manifestation, how does the horror present itself? How does it like reveal itself? Banishment, how do the players defeat it, right? That seems like an obvious. And then slumber, which is helpful for us, which is that like it's never really gone. And that's something we think a lot about in campaigns because, again, with like what you were saying about fantasy, and I can throw kobolds at people, horror, sci-fi, these are totally different campaign structures, right? And what D&D has done really, really well is convince people, not like in a nefarious way, but like that the adventuring day, that like, okay, and what happens tomorrow is the way all role playing should operate. And we're trying really hard to establish a new baseline for Mothership that's like, this is the worst night in these people's lives. And then 6 months are going to go by, or a year's going to go by, and some of these people are going to come back, and others aren't going to come back. And that requires a different way of thinking about like, what is a campaign? What are characters? Who am I playing? And we're trying to convince more and more writers to do sequels where we return places. Um, Even a campaign structure, you play our Android Mega Dungeon Gradient Descent, and barely make it alive, and you steal an artifact, and you go sell it, and you move on to other things. We then want to propose that you return to that dungeon in 3 or 4 years of game time when one of your players is retired with tons of money from having sold this artifact, and having somebody say, we need you to go back. You're the only person who's been there and survived. We need you to return to the deep. That's like, for me as a player, that's like catnip. You're never going to get there in a D&D game though, because it's day by day and something new's happening. But in Mothership, if you're willing to learn those sort of campaign tools to say like, you can zoom out, you can zoom in, you can set player characters aside, they can make a lot of money. They can return to normal life. The game's not going to break if somebody goes back to their wife and kids, and a year later we say like, it's back, or 30 years later, like in the case of It or whatever, like it was never really done. So slumber is a part of that grander strategy on our end to get people to think about campaigns at a different scale and time frame than they're used to with like a game like D&D.
Yeah, I really dig that too, especially as like an older gamer. I'm not a kid, a teenager anymore, and so my gaming schedule is going to be very different.
Yeah.
Especially with this kind of game. So like, so I still have my like ongoing D&D campaign with my friends. We aren't able to meet every week because people have jobs and kids and other things, but we meet when we can, and that's kind of our recurring thing because it's light and easier, and we could do it virtually very easily. But I feel like a game like Mothership is perfect for like that 2 or 3 times a year when we can actually get
Yeah.
together in one place. And now it's also a moody, atmospheric game is so much better when you're physically all in the same place. And I love what you're saying about that slumber because it's perfect for like, okay, we're going to do this tonight, and then we might not get together to play Mothership for a year. But it
Yeah.
actually works in the game. Like that totally makes sense. Like, okay, a year has passed, and uh-oh, the horror is returning. Something wicked this way comes. So it really fits into my style of play too.
We think about that as a, older person who's got kids, is now when we develop games, we say like, internally we're going like, one, when are they going to play this? What game are they going to stop playing to start playing this? Is anyone going to give up their regular D&D night? Probably not. So how does it fit in to a gamer schedule? We think of these as essentially like lifestyle brands, right? And you're giving people like new clothes to wear. Are they going to want to wear these new outfits? Like, are they going to become a prep from being a goth or whatever? A role-playing game like has that kind of commitment. And so we're saying like, how realistically, how often are they going to get to play this? And story games and indie games have been pretty good about like, this is a one-time experience, that you'll play every now and then. Totally for that. A lot of love for those games. I've played a lot of them and loved them. I tend to enjoy campaigns. Like I tend to like recurring stories, but I don't have the like weekly 8-hour game sessions in me. And I wouldn't be a good dad like at this point in my life if I did, right? And a good husband. So I have to design games that are going to feel compelling and feel like a compelling campaign, but that narratively are going to fit into a schedule of like you could play it a few times and then take a break. And if we were to play, every couple years, I get a bone up my butt to do like a OD&D mega dungeon campaign and be like, oh, we'll do it room by room. And I'm going like, this will never happen because the time commitment it requires is so massively huge. I'm not going to start playing, Dungeon World or anything like that, but it makes me go like the games that we work on have to feel compelling to the kind of player I am right now. Because there's like, oh, we leveled up once, we're level one. If we play once a month and we do the standard treasure, stuff, we're only going to be level 2 by the end of the year, and it's exhausting to think about. You feel like you've lost before you even started playing. That's part of the reason we took levels and experience out of Mothership, right? Was to just say like your character's complete. It's just the adventures you go on. There's no sense of like, what am I missing out on? Are we ever going to get to level 20? That kind of thing.
I mean, you made me think of like a couple of years, well, it's probably more than a couple of years ago. It's probably 5, 6, 7 years ago at this point. But I got like a free download of the Hidden Shrine of Tamashan conversion for D&D, no, for Roll20. It was for Roll20. And I was just looking at it. I was like, oh, they did a really cool job with this. The maps look great. You've got like all the monsters and treasures. Like it was just a really well done conversion for virtual tabletop. So I was like, you know what? The next time there's like a break in our regular campaign, I ran it for my friends, and it was great. I love that adventure. It's a brilliant adventure. I've played it in other campaigns and it's been great. But the issue here was that, yeah, we're older gamers. So like we started it and then like the next time we played was like 3 weeks later. And when you're doing that kind of mega dungeon or really just like one setting sort of crawl, it was like, oh, like no time has passed in campaign. We've literally just walked from one room to the next, but none of the players remembered what the hell was going on. Like we spent half the game just being like, why are we here again? What happened last time? So yeah, those kinds of games just don't work for me anymore. Not in this context, at least.
Even in a product line, we go like, okay, our team is small, just a handful of people. How many game lines do we want to support? We want to have enough that there's like some diversity, and like if one game falls out of favor, we can climb on another game. Um, but like Lifetime, we go like, okay, let's say we release one book a year, right, for 10 years. Um, that's a very successful game line. How much of the surface do we want to have scratched with that, right? And I think there is a mistake both for like for designers and aspiring publishers to think like D&D, like global domination is the goal rather than like, let's set this up from the outset. It's going to be 2 core rule books and we're going to outline the setting in 5 books. We'll do one book every year for 5 years. That's enough for that line, to be successful, to give you all the tools you need. Um, it sounds like silly to like talk about it that way, but it goes into the thing of like of time. Like not everything is an open-ended question mark of like, well, you should play this for forever. Um, but we still want something more satisfying than like, well, you'll play this for tonight and that's enough, because there's such an investment up front in learning games.
Yeah. And am I stealing your opportunity to ask questions just because
This
I'm
has
so
been
excited?
beautiful. This like if I say very little, I'm happy as a clam because it means that I have two people that have a lot to say to each other. So I think this has been great. I can't believe our time is almost up. So I'm gonna say, hey, Sean, if someone doesn't own Mothership, I'm assuming you'd say go buy that. But other than that, is there anything else that you think listeners should rush off and purchase that would put some royalties in your pocket?
Well, I want to know what the question was you wrote down.
Oh, me?
Hmm.
Oh my God. So the question I wrote down was, and this is for Dave, and it's a tough question and perhaps an embarrassing one. But Dave, if you could ask Sean to design a game for you, what would that game look like?
Oh man, that's a really good question.
I wrote it down and I was like, it's almost unfair. Like that should be a
Well,
blog
it's like
post,
an
not an interview question.
underserved genre, yeah, that like you don't think has been hit well.
Well, I mean, the first place my brain went, and I don't know if this would be my first choice, but it's the first thing I thought of, is that there have been times when I've really loved playing like hard-boiled and detective and even spy games. So like I go back to Top Secret being the
Yeah.
first one, but like other like sort of indie ones that are about more like less James Bond and more about like hard-boiled detectives and doing detective stories. I think games like that can be super fun, but much like horror, that's a really hard game for a game designer to, not just for the game designer, but for a GM to put together, is like, because to do like a heist, now you've really got to think ahead. Like, okay, what's the plot for my players, and like how is the thing they're trying to steal put away, or like who did this mystery if they're trying to figure out who shot the secretary. Like there's got to be twists and turns. So it's the kind of thing that's very challenging to run. In the same way that I think, Mothership facilitates that horror storytelling. It might be cool to see it facilitate telling thrillers and mysteries.
So those genres are very, very close to my heart. I'm a big pulp, hard-boiled reader. Our son was almost named Dashel because I'm such a big Dashiell Hammett fan.
Nice.
Um, uh, and Richard Stark in the Parker series on the heist side, I really love too. Um, so it's something we're thinking of tackling in two ways. One, I wrote an old blog post a long time ago about something I called an investigation sheet. And it was basically like most players don't know how to run an investigation, right? And so we run these games like they're dungeon crawls, or the people are just like insane psychopaths, like running into rooms and pointing guns at people and demanding confessions or whatever. And so I said, like, here's a sheet, and it just has like suspect, means, motive, and opportunity, you know, and like a point of location or something like that. Um, and I was like, there's two ways you can use this sheet. One, you give it to the players. This is an in-world document. When they meet somebody, they can write their name down on suspect. And when they have means, they can write down the means, the motive, and the opportunity. And they can literally go down the list and find out all this information. And there's maybe two people with means, motive, and opportunity. Everybody else has disqualifying stuff. Um, and then when you get down to those two people, you find, oh, there's a clue that actually this person didn't have the opportunity to, or this person's alibi fell apart when we zoomed in on the two final suspects, right? So I thought, one, that's a great thing that the players could have. And then they could have files, right? And then they could go back through their old files and go, like, we missed this on some old case. But on the referee side, it's great because you just fill out that sheet and you go, like, here's all the suspects, here's all their means, motive, and opportunity. Boom, this is what I need to write. So it's a thing we're thinking of for a paranormal investigation game that we're working on called Spiral, which is our version of, Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green. Um, but it centers the investigation like right at the forefront. And we're trying to develop kind of like a key, but for social encounters, that would be as ubiquitous as like a dungeon key, but for like, what do they know? What's going to push them? What's going to like, what does it require to run this? Because that's another thing where like the infrastructure is just not very good for giving referees the tools they need to run like a social encounter, and it's not very codified. And I think a lot of people want to use like combat as an example, where they go like, well, we'll do social combat and we'll roll my charisma versus your will. But that's not what I'm interested in modeling in this kind of game. I really want it to be hard. I want to have to ask questions and I want to get that information. And so I think what it requires is more like a choose your own adventure novel, but like in a very short form where you go like, if they push, if they this, if violence is threatened, if they have this leverage on this person, this is the information you'll get. And finding a way to put that on a page like a dungeon like Stonehell, where it's like, here's the information, here's the thing, here's the flow chart, here's the key. We're trying to develop that internally so that not only can we run investigations very quickly and write them very quickly, but we can set a standard that our third party publishers could copy very quickly and say, like, this is how we do investigations here. Because Call of Cthulhu, which I love, also just doesn't do this. And they've had decades and decades to solve this problem. You just have to go like, the thing they don't know is, and it's like, well, how do I keep track of that? Two, I love the heist genre. And it's really tough because it is not a high selling genre in RPGs, right? And I don't think that's because like there's no good game for it or whatever. I just think like fantasy, it's gonna go fantasy, sci-fi, Cthulhu, zombies, right? Um, and so we've had to tackle it from a product design standpoint. We have a game called Heist. We have rules for it. It's based on the WG Star Wars game, but with some other stuff thrown in. Um, the Mothership Death Cup mechanic, where you don't know if somebody's alive or dead until you check the cup, that was developed for Heist, and then we were like, we're not saving good ideas for games that don't exist. If it's a good idea, it goes in the game now. We got to move on. Um, I'll talk about our product idea off camera because I love it so much. But we are looking at a Heist game. But again, the thing about it is, are the questions we're asking are, how does it fit into people's schedule? And give a compelling experience. What is the shape of the product, like in a medium is the message kind of way? And it's not for us just like a business as usual, like read a module sort of thing. Um, but yeah, those are genres that are very, very near and dear to my heart, and I want to do them well when we have the capital to take a big risk on underserved genres, or to, in the case of paranormal activity, to take a risk on a genre that, like very much like D&D, has a 800-pound gorilla already in its corner.
That sounds awesome. I can't wait to see what you come out with. And since you were talking about it and heists, I'll use the opportunity to plug another one of my favorite games. Is you made me think of a game that has a really interesting take on heists. It is not a heist game, but Kevin Kolb's Time Watch has such a cool
Oh,
gameplay mechanism that there are some adventures that they've done that are heist adventures, they're not approaching it from a solve this yourself, but they're using the time travel mechanism. Like, so all the heists become Bill and Ted movies, basically. Like
That's
you say,
awesome.
okay, well, oh, I didn't realize we were going to set off this alarm. So tomorrow when I'm in my time machine, I will come back and I will have this. So it's a totally different way of approaching heights, but it has really interesting mechanisms for solving that kind of problem of how do I get from we need to steal this thing to, oh, we've stolen it. It's really fun.
That's really cool.
All right. Well, I'm gonna stop taking advantage of your time and say, David, everyone should go out and buy of Dice and Men, correct?
Yes, they should buy Dice and Men. There was a new edition that came out last year where we talked about the rise of fifth edition and everything that happened there.
And you were one of only two people to get Lorraine Williams to talk on the record since she left TSR. And that information is in of Dice and Men, making it a beyond all the other reasons it's a crucial text, but that is a sparkling jewel of the piece. So listeners, if you have not purchased it, go purchase it. He talked to Lorraine Williams. And Sean, thank you so much for being on here and taking the time, especially with two kids. It's deeply appreciated.
I was very happy to be here. This is a great conversation. Would love to talk to you guys again.